I am now on the MTK hotline, and I'd like to welcome back a very special guest. He is the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops The King. He's also the author of the fabulous book, Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. From the north of England, Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, welcome back to the Mop Tops The King.
Oh, hello, Steve. It's great to be back talking to you again. And what a really interesting subject.
Yes, today's topic is the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein. And personally, I don't think the average Beatles fan really knows much about Brian Epstein and the major role he played in the Beatles' success. So we're going to talk about Brian's life, his upbringing, how he became the Beatles manager, and his impact on the Beatles, as well as his major impact when he died at the young age of 32. But before we begin, I would like to ask you, if the Beatles never met Brian Epstein, do you think we'd still be talking about the Beatles today?
I think we would, actually. It's a really interesting time. The early 60s was a massive cultural change, and teenage marketplace was very much emerging. And I think it coincided with the emergence of the Beatles. I think there was a little bit of, perhaps both drove each other, the Times and the Beatles.
We know that the Beatles were working class, and Brian was more, middle class or upper class when they met?
He was very much middle class, shopkeeping middle class. His father owned a furniture store. They bought the Nems building next door. So Brian was selling furniture, records, musical instruments. And he also had a private education. He paid to go to school.
Okay. So I know some people know the story, but could you tell us, how did Brian Epstein become the Beatles manager?
It started with the song My Bonnie, released in October of 61, Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, as they were called on that. And famously, on the 28th of October 61, a guy called Raymond Jones apparently walked into Brian's record store and asked for a copy of My Bonnie, although some people tend to think that's the story is a little apocryphal. But something inspired Brian to go to the Cavern Club on the 9th of November to see the Beatles. And what impressed him was that they played one of John's first thing he ever wrote, Hello Little Girl. And Brian could see the potential for a songwriting group. And then they had a meeting with the Beatles in the December. He decided to become their manager, became official in the January. And in the June of 62, he formed Nems Enterprises, a company specifically to handle the Beatles and his other groups and concerts. He did a lot of concert promotion as well.
What did Brian think of the Beatles? They were all dressed in leather at the time, weren't they? And he changed their appearance dramatically.
Absolutely. The Hamburg days, they were very much into the Gene Vincent look of leather clothes. But he certainly changed that. It's interesting that Andrew Oldham, the Stones manager, went down the opposite route, and he was very much down the line of, would you let your daughter go out with a Rolling Stone?
Yeah. So was he responsible for getting them into the suits and the ties, Brian Epstein?
Very much so. He was very much into the very clean-cut image. In fact, they wore lapelless jackets initially, and then there was a thing that was called the Beatles jacket, and it had a rounded, buttoned up to the neck, basically, and had a rounded neck with no collar. And that was known as a Beatles jacket.
What would you say the most significant thing that Brian did for the Beatles to make them, over the top, to be just mega famous?
He was very important because he guided their early career. I wouldn't say it was exactly the right place at the right time, but they weren't the first people to release a single, first Liverpool group to release a single. That was Howie Casey and the Seniors in the January. But I think he had a great marketing flair. His business skills weren't as good. He didn't get a good record deal. But I think what he did for the Beatles was establish them into the national charts with Love Me Do. And because the times were changing so much at that time, the Beatles drove on from there and just became the biggest band in the world.
So Brian had a hard time shopping the Beatles to record labels in London. He went everywhere, didn't he?
He certainly approached a number of people. And then it was that John Lennon song, Hello Little Girl, that he took to EMI and George Martin. It all took off from there, because they famously failed their first audition with Decca in the January of 62, when Brian Poole and the Tremolos beat them to it.
We're speaking with Derek Shelmerdine. He is the resident rock and roll historian of the Mop Tops and the King. Derek, many people probably don't know Brian Epstein also managed many other musical acts.
Oh, absolutely. He had quite a big stable. The second act he signed, it was Jerry and the Pacemakers, and they were the first people in the UK to have 3 consecutive number ones. And Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. It was John Lennon who suggested to Billy Kramer he should use the letter J in his name. And then the Foremost, who finally took John Lennon's Hello Little Girl into the charts in '63. Cilla Black. These are just the people from Liverpool that he actually managed. But it was a cottage industry in a way, because most of these acts were produced by George Martin, and an awful lot of Lennon-McCartney songs were the hits for these acts in the early days. But he also managed people like P.J. Proby, briefly, and the Moody Blues in late '65, '66. They actually supported the Beatles on their last UK tour in the December of '65. So he actually managed and organised an awful lot of tours.
Derek, unfortunately, we're running a little short on time on this week's show. Could you please come back next week and we can finish talking about Brian Epstein and his relationship with the Beatles?
Oh, absolutely. There's just so much to talk about. I mean, Brian is just such a big part of their story.
I really appreciate that, Derek. So we'll see you next week, same time, same station. And in the meantime, be well.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for inviting me, Steve.